Welcome to file organization and kind of the own overview of how the post-production process works for 360. So we found that 360 projects, although they're very similar to traditional video projects, have a lot of complexity in the post-production process, generally because there's a lot of different people involved. You might just have people that are just stitching the footage. You might also have, you've got generally several people working on cleaning up and removing things like the tripod and doing rotoscoping, other people doing special effects, sound design, mixing is usually a separate person. The color grading might also be a different person. So with all of those different people involved, making sure that the whole team is really organized and that files aren't getting lost and that everyone is able to clearly communicate about like what the latest version of a file is or the latest version of a shot is. All of those things become really, really important as your team grows. So, so these are some of the organization structures that we use that we find help mainly just keep everybody on the same page. That keeps the project moving forward and helps us hit our deadlines. So, in general, the process for starting post-production starts with the capture of the content. So we're shooting a lot of 360 videos, so we're in the field and utilizing several different cameras sometimes, and all of that footage is initially backed up onto two different hard drives. So we'll have like a master version of all the footage, and then we'll have a backup version of all the footage. And then once we get back into our office here, the footage is then copied over to a high capacity networked attached storage device, or also called a NAS. You probably are familiar with these or may have heard of these. So we use one that has about 120 terabytes of storage in it. And that's what we use for active projects. So we sometimes have we sometimes have multiple projects happening at the same time. And so projects get loaded on there for when they're working. And the reason for that network attached storage is that we have a lot of different workstations that are connected to it. Each of those workstations are pretty powerful computers, and they're attached to that network storage via 10 gigabit Ethernet. So 10 gigabit is kind of a standard that is just starting to be utilized more, I think, in kind of general networking. But it's a really high speed network that's sort of gives you sort of the speed of sort of Thunderbolt, if you're familiar from a Mac ecosystem. But this allows us to all the computers to have the access to all the content and all the footage that they need, but we don't have to constantly back up hard drives for every single person and then make sure things are synced between different workstations. For people that are working outside of our main office area, they'll log into our software, log into like a workstation that we have here locally for them that has all the software that they need, and we've been using a piece of software called Parsec, which essentially allows you to, anywhere in the world, you can log in and have really high resolution screens of the actual workstation. And it works with really low latency, and they sort of built it originally for gaming. So it works really well, but we really think that that's been a big improvement in our process, which allows us to hire people from, really all kind of around the world to work on our projects and help us with things. But we don't have to worry about trying to ship them, tens of terabytes worth of hard drives and getting those back and keeping everybody in sync. They can just essentially use a video tunnel and log into a local workstation that we have set up here. They get access all the software that they need. And it gives us a lot of flexibility to sort of bring new people onto the team. So that's been great for us. And then for the computers that we have in general, we've been running Windows-based computers. We do have a couple of Macs, but we don't really utilize those in our process so far. Generally, it's because they graphics cards are not as powerful, and or the there isn't like the right software that we need for Macs. So if you're just getting into this, I would recommend that you um, basically get a high-end gaming computer. Is essentially the kind of computers that we tend to use for our workstations. So the kind of the ones that we're working with right now are Intel based computers with NVIDIA 3090 cards on them. And the reason for the 3090 cards is they're high-end graphics cards, so they have really good rendering capabilities, but these ones also have 24 gigs of RAM built into them. So when we're doing real high resolution 360 content, 8K by 8K stereoscopic footage, or we've been doing some experiments with sort of 12K and 16K monoscopic footage. Once you kind of get in those really high resolutions, the extra memory is really important for both resolve and for just kind of stability issues. So having a graphics card that has a lot of GPU RAM is a really good thing to look for if you're building out a system. The other thing that we've done is that Resolve and Fusion, which is what we use to edit and composite our footage, is Resolve tends to use a lot of system memory, so a lot of RAM. So we've also upgraded our machines to have 128 gigabytes of RAM. Those have been kind of like the more important thing. So a good GPU and a good amount of RAM in the computers, is an important aspect of what you should be looking for if you're going to be building a workstation for yourself. So getting into how we organize our clips, in general, all of my projects have the same kind of structure. There is a main folder. If you look up here, where we have the month that the project started, the year it was filmed in, and then a little readable name of the project. So we split all of our projects into their own little folders like this, and then we organize everything underneath that. It also makes it really easy if you're doing backups or you need to move things around to different drives. You can just grab this root folder, copy it over, and then if everything is copied correctly, then you've got an instant backup of everything you need. The inside the folder, that root folder, is we have like the same kind of organization, and we keep this really, really consistent throughout all of our projects. And the idea for this is that anybody at any time in the company's history should be able to go into any project folder at any time and not get lost. The big folder that is always included is the content folder. The content folder really holds pretty much all of the video, audio, and still footage that is captured as a part of a project. Documents is just general documents that get created as a part of a project. Exports has all of the final renders of that come out of a project. Graphics holds everything from motion graphics to still, like lower thirds, things like that. And so you put things there, music, the music elements that you have. Project files go in here. So this is a project that was started back when we were still using Premiere and After Effects and Reaper. So our old system utilized Premiere and After Effects to sort of edit and clean up the footage. We are now using a system called Resolve, DaVinci Resolve, and DaVinci Fusion, which are their editing and compositing programs. So they have their own, Resolve has its own sort of project system that it uses. We actually use that with a server. So we'll get into that in the, so you can, if you want to know more about that, you can go into the chapters specifically about Resolve and how I set it up. The other thing that you'll also find in here are Mystica VR projects. So when we're doing stitching projects will also end up here. And then there's another folder for sound effects. So there is a kind of a template folder structure that we use. So we've got a zip file that's included here in the links below. along with in the video description here. So if you want to kind of just get started and use this as a template, and obviously you can modify it for your own project's needs, but if you're ever working on one of our projects, like this is how we do it. So inside the content folder, immediately we start breaking things down by the days. So on the actual shoot, how many ever days of production there'll be a different folder that organizes everything that was captured, all the audio, all the video, all the stills, all the trying to think if there's any other assets, if there was like any scans, like all of that kind of content goes into like each day. And then we split it by like how many like different days of production. And that just helps us keep things organized. So if like you're looking for something that was shot on, day 2 of this project, you know where to look for that. And then in these folders, so if we go a little bit deeper into day 1, also note that day 1 also has the date. So 2019. So the first 4, and this is the kind of like a pretty common way that we date all of our files, but we start with a 4-number year. So in this case, this is 2019, and then the next 2 numbers are the month. So this is 02, so February, and then 14, so the 14th, which is Valentine's Day, I think, actually. So this is just like a nice way for us to sort of, if we ever needed to know when something was captured, you can always look at the date here. I find that pretty useful to sort of keep as a part of our organization. And then there's usually 3 main folders inside here. You've got a folder for audio, you've got a folder for footage, and you have a folder for stills. We will be creating a class about how we shoot our projects, and so we will go into that process a bit more. But in general, you will have footage that was captured by a 360 camera of some kind, sometimes multiple different cameras, and that all that content goes into footage. If we're recording audio, like sometimes there's lavs for interviews, or there's an ambisonic mic, which captures surround sound stereo, and that's usually recorded on a separate recorder. Sometimes there are just miscellaneous sound effects that get captured that we might want to use later in post. And so those things go in audio A. And then you'll see that things are split up by audio A, audio C. There's not an audio B in this one because we had a 3rd recorder on this project, but we didn't use it on this day. So audio A just references like a one of the recorders. Usually on a 360 shoot, the audio A is the ambisonic recorder, which is usually recording about four tracks of audio for a specific ambisonic mic. Audio B is often a different recorder. Like we have a stereo recorder that we'll use for sound effects or for plugging shotgun mics and stuff into. Audio C is actually and on this project is a small lav mic that records on its own little pack. So and we keep this consistent throughout at least a project. So that way, if there's like a bunch of things happening, like you always know, like, oh, like, okay, audio A, I can look at my notes and say that audio A has, was the ambisonic recorder. And so that just kind of helps keep things organized. And then we'll break it down by reels. So on a project, when you capture a bunch of stuff onto like one card, that automatically becomes reel 1. And so because this is audio, we say audio reel A001. And this just a way of saying like this is the first card recorded by audio system A. And so throughout, as we record more cards worth of content, then new folders would get made for reel A002 and A003. And so we try to make things a little bit unique in that way, and that they're always counting up, so that you can make sure that like files stay organized wherever they need to be. So so real audio A, this has a bunch of just audio files in it, which we won't get into too much right now. And so audio C also has a reel. And again, so this is just like the card. So the reel you can always think of just as like that card from that recorder from that day. Generally, we try to always copy and back up our footage every single day, so that there's not footage or content from multiple days left on the same card. I find that to be a kind of a more distracting or more confusing way to organize things. So we try to keep it organized by the day, to kind of keep everything together, so that if you're looking for some specific audio from a specific day, you know where to look for it. So that's really what this whole system is about. So again, this just has a little bit of just one, two files in that looks like. Let me just jump to the stills real quick. So stills also, when we're capturing a scene, we will often take still photos that we sometimes will use as photogrammetry plates. And photogrammetry plates are it's like a way of shooting. You can shoot a bunch of still frames, and then you can run those through a program, and then it will create a 3D model of whatever you took photos of. So sometimes in our process, we will shoot a bunch of photos to help remove the tripod, or remove some dolly track, or maybe we're shooting in a place that has a really low ceiling, and so we just to help cover ourselves, we might capture a bunch of stills from that to help clean up the footage in post. We also might just use it as a way to shoot some BTS. So so you can kind of see here what kind of typical things. Often there's a lot of shots of the ground. That's often mostly what we have in here. And so, like, for example, like these photos down here could all be incorporated together to create a 3D model, so that we would have a kind of the exact, texture and stuff of these cobblestones. So it's just one of the things that we all of our shooters tend to capture, just so that our stitching artists who are doing the cleanup work have as many assets available to them as possible to try to make the footage cleanup as cleanly as possible. So let me go back to our content here. So footage is really where the things are. This is where like most of the content is. So we will split up the content by the different cameras. So on this shoot, we had camera A. So that was our primary camera, which is a stereoscopic Candow Obsidian S, which is a 6-lens camera. So all of the content shot by that Obsidian S goes here into camera A, because that was our A camera on this shoot. And then we had a B camera, which was actually this thing called a Kucam, which is also made by Candow, but it's sort of like looks like a little stick. And so it was just kind of like a backup camera, or mostly a behind the scenes camera. So as we were recording things, we recorded stuff in camera B a little bit, but I like to just kind of keep all of that content together, so we know, kind of keep everything in the same spot. So if we open up camera A here, you'll see that we have a reel A001. So that just means that this is the first card from this camera for this project. And then as we open up, we have a couple of folders. This one at the top, the original folder structure. This is where we copy the original footage from these cards. This particular camera has 6 lenses. And so each one of those lenses is attached to a sensor. And each one of those little camera units records on its own SD card, micro SD card. And so when you're filming with it, at the end of the day, you have 6 little micro SD cards from each one of the lenses. And so the first thing that happens when we're just backing up footage in the field is that we will copy over, all the footage from camera 1 or lens 1 into the lens 1 folder, and that gets copied into here. And so we do that for lens 2, lens 3, lens 4, and this just sort of backs up because we have these 6 cards. We organize them into 6 different lenses. Once you're back from a project, or when you're about to create the rough stitches and get things organized, is the content that's inside of lens 1, it only has the footage from one of the cameras. And so Mystica, for it to be able to stitch all of our footage together into a full 360 scene, needs to have all of the clips from that shot inside of one folder. So inside the raw scenes folder that we have here, we'll make a folder for every single clip that was recorded on this reel. So these folders are named, so we've got the name of the reel, which is A001, which matches up with our reel A001 here. And then they're sequentially numbered 001, 0001, 0002, 0003, and so on. And so we know that this is the first clip that was recorded, the second clip that was recorded. And then what we do is we copy all of the video files for shot 1, but from all the lenses we copy all of those video files into this one folder. And this is how Mystica knows that, like, oh, these are all the clips I need to make this shot and render out all these pieces. So as you can see, there are a lot of individual files that are in here. And that is because the Obsidian camera, for instance, so this particular shot was shot on a boat, and I think we recorded maybe 15 minutes worth of content. And so this particular camera, every 3 minutes, it creates a new video file for that lens. So if we open up these with Pot Player here, so we see that this clip here is actually only 3 minutes long. So this is like the very first part of the clip. But then we have all of the different lenses. So lens 3, lens 4, so you can kind of see us going around the circle here, lens 5, lens 6. That's because all these lenses are starting recording at the same time, but they're from sort of different perspectives around the 360 sphere. And then after 3 minutes, all of the cameras stop recording to those files, but immediately start a whole nother set of files, which are these next ones. And so as you're putting these together, there's often a process where you're going to combine all of these video files into one long 15-minute 360 video that has all of the cameras stitched around it. So to learn more about that process, you can look at the 360 stitching Mystica chapters as a part of this tutorial series. But for Mystica to work properly, is that you need to get everything from shot 1 in the same folder. So that is why we organize things into these inside our raw scenes folder, while we have these different folders. So if I pull up these different folders, you can kind of see these are all the original full files that were captured by the camera system. And so this is relatively common in most 360 cameras. Most of these rigs will record a bunch of different little files that all have to be stitched together. So making sure that they all stay organized in the same spot is a really helpful way to not lose track of things. So we see here we've got these are all the video files associated with shot 2. Here's all the ones from shot 3. and so on. So so that's kind of the same. We have that all the way through here for from 9. For 360 footage, one of the things that we've decided to do sort of early on was to only render in the full resolution the footage that we actually needed to use for the edit. The reason for this is that even though we're using some pretty high powerful computers, is that the rendering really high resolution footage it takes an incredible amount of time and processing, and usually we're trying to find the most optimal ways to create content for our clients. And so we also need makes sense to not render out super high resolution footage of everything, because a lot of it we're not going to use. We may shoot a VR project for several days, end up with multiple hours of footage, maybe 10 or 15 hours of footage, and that a lot of that sometimes gets edited down to 5, 7, 10-minute pieces of content. So so if you have hours of footage, and the render times for VR being really high, it probably doesn't make sense to render out super high resolution content for every single thing that you ended up recording. And so we use a process that's similar to some people kind of call it like a proxy workflow, but it is essentially a way where we first thing we do is we render out really low resolution qualities, but we do that of all of our footage. And so this is what we call a rough stitch. And so a rough stitch is often only about 1920 by 19. So these are stereoscopic videos, so they're 3D. So if we look at the content that we have here, this is everything that was captured on day one of this project. So we see here, this clip down here is almost 13 minutes long. There's a bunch of stuff. And as I'm moving around here, you can kind of see how my face is kind of cut off weird. I'm doing, slates. So this is content that is useful, but is not going to end up in a final edit. To be honest, in a project like this, I may only use 30 seconds of this boat ride from somewhere, probably some middle section of it. So, but when it's for editing purposes, it's really helpful to see all of the footage that's available to you. So we start off our process by doing rough stitch is what we call it. So that's often a 1920 by 1920 video file that is rendered out of the full clips, and we'll create that with sometimes with Mystica VR, which is our stitching program, and we'll just run it through low res so that everything renders out super fast. There's certain cameras will also create proxy files automatically for you. So the InstaPro 360 Titan records a proxy file as just a part of its operation. So in that case, that would become your rough stitches that you can use for editing. And these are great. When you have the full version, the full clips, you can sync your audio. You can look at all the footage. This is also really helpful to have. If you can render these things or view these things when you're shooting, you can often, it's a great way to review the footage that you shot and make sure that you have all the things that you want for your edit and things like that. So if you'll notice, all of these files start with the letters RS. And so when we're creating video content, a video clip will go kind of through several stages, life cycle stages. So it starts off as an RS or a rough stitch file. And this is like an easy way for us to know that this is a low resolution file. It's not for final use, but it gives us a bunch of other information about where that file came from. So so the RS tells us that it's a rough stitch. A001 tells us that it came from real one. So if you remember, that just means that that's the SD card that the camera was shot with. And so A just lets us know that this was from camera A. So if we said a rough stitch from a camera B, this would actually be B001 or B002 if it was like real 2. And so that's what these four digits and letters and numbers mean. The next 4 are the actual clip number. So in all of our projects, we'll include this as well, a sample of this, but all of our projects use we have this is actually designed to be printed out in like a half sheet, but we keep handwritten camera logs of all of our shots, and these are available and usually digitized for people that are working on our projects. And it tells you a bunch of information about how this particular shot was captured. So it'll tell you like, okay, so shot 1, and it'll tell you the things like the frame rate and the ISO, what shutter angle we shot at, the white balance. If it also, one of the nice things is it also usually tells you the height. So if you're trying to recreate a shot or doing some sort of like match dissolve, and you want the floor plane to sort of be consistent, you can look at your notes and you know exactly how tall it is. So that's sort of what this is. So you've got the version of the file, or what kind of file it is. So a rough stitch, we know that it's coming from camera A and that this is from reel 1. We know that this is shot 1 from reel 1. We also have the date here. So we know this is shot on 2019-02-14. So the 14th of February, 2019. And then these last digits are just sort of created from the stitching software, or it's part of the file name. So these are usually some sort of unique identifier for whatever clip. So as a shot goes through its stitching process, so we'll take all these rough stitches and then we'll bring those into Resolve, and then we'll start editing our content. And then we'll go through a process with our clients, if we have a client, or just internally, where we refine the edit. So we'll watch it a bunch of times. We'll add some music. We'll edit it together until we get to a point where we're really happy with the edit, and no one has any changes to the content of it. And we know, like, we want to use these specific clips from this time code in to this time code out. And then we'll move into the more time consuming parts of 360, which is the cleanup process. Some shots that we've done in the past have taken weeks to clean up. So because of that labor is so intensive, the rendering is really intense. We want to make sure that there aren't going to be any changes to the project. So kind of once we get through our edit and with the rough stitches, and everybody is happy, then we kind of get to a point where we say, okay, like, we're going to lock the picture. And that means that there's not going to be any more additional editing happening. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes at the end of a project, or as we're developing something will change, or we'll need to improve something for some reason. So things do get changed a little bit later on, but because it's a lot more expensive, because of all the time involved, we really try to get our picture lock done with the rough stitches before moving on to the other stages of the editing process. So the next stage that a clip will go through is, once we know, like, for for example, let's say out of this whole big clip from, which is let's see, let's open this one. So this is like, say this is a 15-minute clip. We would never use all 15 minutes, but maybe for example, we would just want to use this clip. So we might use this clip from, say, 12 minutes, 30 seconds, and maybe it goes to 13 minutes and 23 seconds. So in our editing, we would write down those time code in and out numbers. And then we would go and do what we would call the fine stitch. So this is where we go back to Mystica, and we do all of the stitching that needs to be done for that clip, but only from, say, 12:30 to 13:25 or whatever the in and out numbers were. And we'll do things like we'll add our edge points in. We'll make multiple versions for lighting plates, and we'll render those out in full resolution. And those become the fine stitches. So a fine stitch would have the exact same file name as a rough stitch, except that the front letters now change to FS for fine stitch. And then a stitching artist will take the fine stitch files, which are the high resolution files, then they'll run those through Fusion, which is the compositing program. And then they'll do all the work, a bunch of extra work to remove the tripod and to, in this shot, maybe they are cleaning up and replacing this this backdrop here, which is all kind of blown out. But they can use this clip of these mountains and replace it. So they're going to do a lot of work. They're going to probably clean up the ceiling and clean up the base and do everything else that they need to do to clean up a shot. And so when all of that work has been done, then that becomes the final stage of a clip's life cycle, which is the master stitch, or the MS. So then all the files that have had that level of work to them, the cleanup work done to them, are now called MS stitches. So we'll go into more detail once we kind of get into Resolve about these rendering out these different stitches, but just kind of know that there is this 3 stages of a clip. You got your rough stitches, which are used for editing and getting the picture lock. Fine stitches, which have all of the stitching completed done to them in Mystica VR, which is done at full resolution, but only done of the clip, that the in and out points that are actually needed, and not of the whole project, or not of the whole clip. And then there's master stitch, which is the super cleaned up, everything is like the tripods removed, the window plates have been put in if they need them, the lighting and crew have been removed if needed. And the master stitches are the ones that are ready for all the final things. The other kind of advantage of doing a picture lock part of the process is that once you get a picture lock, is that you can, while your team is finishing up the graphics and the stitching and the cleanup, is that the audio team can then also start on, if you're getting custom music composed, your composer can start working on the audio. The sound design can start happening. As you get shots completed, the colorist can start coloring the content. Graphics can start being animated and put in. All of those things can help really, getting that picture lock earlier in the process really helps keep all of that work, like a huge amount of work that you have to put in to sort of polish a project. It keeps it manageable, and it keeps it from you having to do, and the goal is to reduce any unnecessary work. So not doing anything that doesn't, that won't show up in the final project. So, so that's kind of the method that we find works really well. for this, because if you tried to like do master stitching and fine stitching of all of your content, you'd be running out of hard drive space. You'd be spending like days and weeks rendering a bunch of stuff that won't ever get used. So it's really about trying to optimize your time, optimize your efforts. So the fine stitches, so as we see here, these are designated by FS. So these are now full resolution clips. Like for example, so this is a clip of the inside of the store. It's a 40-second clip rendered at full resolution, but in ProRes. That's a 25 gigabyte file. Whereas if we go back to the rough stitch of this original shot was 3 minutes long. But as a low, kind of a low resolution MP4, that whole file is only 479 megabytes. So you can kind of tell, like, that this is like a pretty much more efficient way to use your resources, your computing resources, your storage resources. But the fine stitches are only going to be of just the clips that the actual like little in and out points that you need. And then once this project was more completed, we would start rendering out final stitches, the master stitches into here. And so each clip would eventually have its own, like a master stitch version of itself. And so like go into day 2, same thing. We've got shots, we've got our original folder structure. We've got fine stitches. So it becomes a lot easier to understand, like, if a random file shows up or you can easily see like, oh, like I know I don't even have to open up this file, but I know that this is a fine stitch. So I know that it's full resolution, which means that it's also probably rendered out as ProRes 422. I know that it is from camera A, that it is from reel 2. I know that it is shot to from that reel, and I can tell that it was shot in 2019 on February 15th, and that this is this V1 here at the end. So our versioning process is to always just, anytime like a version is made of a file. So sometimes you go and you think you've got, you did all your work correctly in Mystica and you rendered out a stitched video file. But sometimes maybe you realize that there was like a small mistake made somewhere and that you're going to have to go back and re-render something. So in that case, then you would just keep the file name the same, but just change the version number, the last number here, from V1 to V2. This really just keeps everything organized chronologically so that everybody is very clear that, like V2 is a version of a file that was created after V1. So generally, if there's any questions about something, usually you can look at the last version of a file, and that's going to be the most up to date or most error free or problem free video file. So we use this kind of V1, V2, V3 structure for all of our naming conventions. So if it's a project file, it'll be whatever project file V1, and then V2. Like every time you do a save or you do it like a major version of something, you just call it a V3 and a V4. Having worked in teams before where people would be like, say like, oh, yada yada project final version, or when people start try to say stuff like that, inevitably you're always wrong and you're changing things, and then you kind of get into this problem where you've got final 2 or final copy totally final version. It's kind of I feel like a running joke in video world. So for us, you can just keep it simple, just V1, V2, V3, and we'll make as many versions as necessary. We'll get to V18 and V19 and so on. So that allows us to just always be clear throughout the entire lifespan of a project, what is the most recent version? Where should we be looking first for our project files? So yeah, hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of how we internally organize our footage. There is a zip file that has a basic kind of folder template that you can take a look at and utilize for your own projects. But yeah, I would just encourage you to keep things consistent throughout for all of your projects from kind of here on out. Find a process that works for you and keep that consistent. And that makes it just a million times easier. Like I can't tell you, like going back even just 4 or 5 years to projects that have this folder structure, which is kind of the same. Like I can immediately open up a project, know exactly where I'm at. I'm not confused about what a project, what the versioning of a project is, or what a file, like which file is which. And so it just makes it really, really easy for the entire team. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Hopefully this wasn't too long. So until the next one, thanks. I hope you're enjoying this preview of my Cinematic 360 Video Post-Production class. You can get this tutorial and 5 complete chapters for free by signing up at learn.voyre.com. The full class includes 10 hours of content covering stereoscopic, 360 video, 180 VR, and more. It's now available at learn.voyre.com, so go ahead and check it out.